looked at me, he pushed me onto the couch, started putting my
The meeting will begin in 1 minute. The meeting will begin in 1 minute.
after you sent me to hospital.
I'd like to call the Land Use Committee meeting to order on October 20th, 2014. Thanks everyone for being here, and also to those watching at home. We have first item on the agenda is approval of minutes of July 15th. Can I have a motion and a second?
Move to approve.
Second.
All in favor, aye?
Aye.
Opposed? No. Motion carries unanimously. Our discussion today, we have one item on the agenda is discussion of residential parking. This came about from one of our council members who had a constituent call concerning a tractor that was parked in a yard of a neighbor. And so we thought it might be a good idea that we reviewed what the situation is, what can and cannot be left or parked and that kind of thing on the street and in yards. So with that in mind, Paul Binkford, our Assistant City Attorney, is going to give us an overview of the law itself.
Thank you, Councilor Rolfing, and I'm just going to go through a general description of the ordinance, and then obviously if there's any specific questions, we can go from there. The last major changes made to our residential parking ordinance, 160.553, were in 2011. The residential parking ordinance has various things included in it. One of those things indicates that you can't have commercial vehicles that are parked in residential neighborhoods, residential property. Back in about 2010, 2011, there were neighborhood complaints about commercial vehicles that were parked in single-family residences and in different residential areas, and there was enforcement that took place as a result of that. Went before the City Council because there were various businesses that were concerned that they had employees who had service vehicles who would need access to those service vehicles because of being on call for a particular situation or had reason that they would need to have those service vehicles at home. And so in 2011, there was discussion and eventually some modifications were made that delineated commercial vehicles from service vehicles, still not allowing commercial vehicles on residential property or to be parked there other than for when somebody was coming over to do service, maybe a couple of hours, but allowing service vehicles and people who operated the service vehicles to have them on their property. There are also other aspects of the residential parking requirements that deal with recreational motor vehicles and boats and the rules regarding what can be parked and for what period of time on property and in yards. As you indicated, this is an issue that came up in reference to a tractor that was parked on a property. Tractors are not something that we get many complaints about or many concerns about. As we go through the numbers, I think if you include nuisance vegetation and snow issues, there are approximately 6,000 to 7,000 nuisance complaints that the city receives a year for code enforcement in general. Of those 6,000 to 7,000 complaints a year, some years you may get 1 to 2 tractor complaints, some years you may not get any complaints. It's not something that we see very often from an enforcement perspective. And there certainly was a situation where an individual raised concerns about a tractor that was parked on residential property. In reviewing the ordinance, our office determined that there were arguments both for and against enforcing it, and we chose not to enforce against this particular tractor that was there. In reviewing the ordinances, we gave the benefit of the doubt to the property owner that had the tractor on their particular property. But again, that's one specific incident in reference to whether tractors can be on property or not. It isn't a situation we had very often. We certainly used discretion in our office on the incident that you discussed in determining that was not an enforcement issue for our office at this time. But if anybody has any more specific questions or would like to discuss the residential parking ordinance more, we can certainly do that. Obviously, from a policy perspective, that's this body's determination, or as the city council determined from a policy perspective. But from an enforcement perspective, I just wanted to put it in, give you an idea of how big of an issue it is from an enforcement perspective and the number of complaints comparatively that we get in reference to tractors.
Can I ask just real quick, did you know this was a full-size farm tractor type thing, or was it a lawnmower type tractor?
It is a tractor, and one of the questions that comes up from an enforcement perspective is when does it go from a lawn tractor to another tractor? Because there's certainly lots of people who have various sizes of lawn tractors in their yard for mowing purposes, for snow removal purposes, and that was one of the issues that in this particular case was discussed internally, and ultimately the decision was reached not to pursue this from an enforcement perspective based upon the ordinance.
Do I have some questions or anything from?
Sure.
Councilor Anderson?
Okay. Well, let's stay with the tractors, Paul.
Sure.
The difference between, I guess, an operating tractor, or like a Bobcat, those type of things. How do we oversee that in the ordinance?
Sure. Commercial vehicles are defined within the ordinance, as are motor vehicles in general. We look at these we look at them on a case-by-case basis in terms of where they're located, where they're parked, how they're being used, in determining whether enforcement will be received. Obviously, there's the general rule there, and if you've got a Bobcat in your yard, you can't have a Bobcat in your yard, is the bottom line. But certainly we look at these cases on an individual basis. We look at the other factors that are involved in terms of the neighbor disputes that are involved and those kind of issues that are happening as well.
Now, what about I know this has been residential, but what about the same thing with properties that are considered commercial?
I mean, there are, this residential parking ordinance addresses properties that are in the DD, AD, and MD forms, which are new under the new zoning ordinances. It used to be more RS1, RS2. I know that Ms. Goldhammer would know those areas better than I do, but generally we're talking about residential areas when we're talking about the DD, AD, and MD forms.
Yeah. And what if these vehicles are non-runnable? They're just on the lot, they're displays?
Sure. And you know that there is some overlap between zoning and health in reference to those ordinances. There are health ordinances that deal with unlicensed, inoperable vehicles that, when there's a vehicle on someone's property and it's not properly licensed and it's not operable, certainly also falls under our health ordinances from an enforcement perspective.
Okay. And then, if I may.
You bet.
Okay. I believe in 2011, we did make some changes as far as on-street parking for trailers, boats, things like that. Could you speak to that? Yes,
there were certainly some changes that were made in reference to on-street parking and off-street parking. Part of what was changed in 2011 is that for an RV and a boat, that owners were given a period of 48 hours to unload and load and for the cleaning aspect of it. There are certain length restrictions in terms of, an RV under over a certain length, and I don't remember the exact number of feet as we're sitting here right now. It seems like it's 22 feet or 22 feet. If it's over 22 feet, you can't park it on the street, and so there are length restrictions also for that.
Okay, what about the trailers and boats? Is that the same way, length restrictions, or?
Trailers and boats are allowed for 48 hours. In terms of the length of a boat, I think that the okay. Okay. And so, yes, we're not talking about the 48-hour rule on the street. We're talking about that on the property. But in terms of length, I think we're still talking about 22 feet.
Does it have to be connected to a vehicle, or can it just be disconnected, chalked, and left on the street?
And those are good questions. But from a code enforcement perspective, we deal with the vehicles that are parked on the property, and the police deal with the ones that are parked on the street. And so I generally don't deal with the ones that are parked on the street from a code enforcement perspective, because those are cited differently through the police department. Ms. Goldhammer may know the answer to that question. But
that's right, but it is, they do the total length of 22 feet, whether it's hooked on to something.
So you're saying that the 48 hours is for parking in your own driveway?
it is for loading and unloading of yes, and that was one of the 2011 changes that was made by the City Council.
And what is I know you don't enforce that, but you know the law on it, the ordinance on it for parking it on the street? I think it's still 48 hours, isn't it, or something?
The length requirement certainly applies to the street, and there are, I know that there are rules as to how long you can have it parked without moving it, whether that's 24 or 48 hours, Rex, or excuse me, Councilor Rolfing. I'm not involved in the day-to-day operation of that one, so I don't know where that is.
Want me to help?
Yeah, if you could, that'd be great.
Good afternoon. My name is Shauna Goldammer. I'm Zoning Enforcement Manager. To answer your question on on-street parking, primarily there's two rules that are enforced by the police department, as Paul indicated. The 22-foot length, and that has to do with the total length of the vehicle. If you've got a pickup with a trailer, it's the total length. So if that's detached, then that's two separate things that they measure. So the 22 feet applies to the length of the total vehicle, including if a trailer's attached. The other ordinance has to do with abandoned vehicles. After 24 hours, a vehicle that hasn't moved could be considered abandoned and ticketed and towed by the police department. Of course, if it's parked in the street, it also has to be licensed and operable. If those criteria are not met, the police department will issue usually a warning ticket and ask you to move it. And if it's not moved within 24 hours, or it's not really a high priority for the police. So if they do give you a warning ticket and when they get back to it, it hasn't moved, then they have the authority to tow that away.
Yes, go ahead.
One last one. Semis without
Yes.
the trailer on it, parked in residential.
Semi is a commercial vehicle
Thank
So
you.
they cannot be parked in,
in a residential district. Correct.
Thank you.
Councilor Jameson, anything? That was your baby, as I remember, the recreational vehicles.
Yeah, thanks
I
for
put you on the
reminding
spot
us.
or anything?
I stayed away from that.
Oh,
No, I'm good. I think Shauna's doing a great job. The ordinance change we made in 11 corrected a large issue that the community had been giving us feedback on, the RV issue. And like this tractor issue, I don't sense as a big issue, but I never did see the tractor, but I think they used their best judgment, and
right,
I'm good.
okay. And I think that's probably the way it needs to continue to be handled. It's on a case-by-case basis. And most people are pretty reasonable when you talk to them, and so that would be good. Appreciate your time.
Okay.
Anything else from, I have one, if I could have Mike Cooper come up. I'm going to surprise you with this one, Mike, and I don't mean to throw you under the bus or anything like that, but some of us have gotten some constituent concerns about the solar farm that's proposed in Lincoln County.
Yeah, Minnehaha County.
It's in Minnehaha County? Okay. That's on the border there. Could you, have we done, what kind of research or anything are we doing or do we do into that kind of a situation that would, how the impact, what the impact would be to the neighbors, to the environment, to all that kind of stuff before we go there?
Right. Okay, this is a joint item that would be coming forward for the City Council and the County Commission. It's a conditional use permit that was appealed after the Joint Planning Commission voted to approve it. There was an appeal by the adjoining property owners to bring it forward for a second vote. And so that has been scheduled for...
Next week.
Yes. And if you recall, before that happened, we brought to you an amendment to our zoning ordinance, our joint zoning ordinance, that provided for the conditional use permit standards for a solar energy farm, basically. So the issue, the criteria that we put into the ordinance is what we're using now in terms of determining if we would support it or not support it. And I don't have all the criteria at the top of my head, but I think the main issue for the neighbors was, or is, the visual impact. Could there be additional landscaping or screening? I think those are some of the questions that were brought up as a result of that.
Could you make that available to all of us, what those are and how
Sure.
we're looking at it
Yep.
before our meeting next week so that we can
Yep.
have a little time to review it beforehand? Would that make sense to you guys?
Yep. So
And if there's any other indication of a negative or a positive impact for this, what they would be,
right, we'll be happy to put that together for you.
we
Okay.
would greatly appreciate that
Okay, thank you.
much. Okay, anything else for the good of the order? Any other open discussion? Okay, I appreciate your time. Meeting adjourned.